right, good morning. We are live. Welcome everybody to the training, learning, and development community. This is a session at part of the XR playlist, Extended Realities playlist. We are talking about virtual reality, augmented reality, mixed reality. I don't know. Are there any other realities that we have to be concerned with right now, James?
Real reality.
Real reality.
Uh-uh.
Yeah, and good morning. Hey, Kara, thanks for coming in this morning. Great to have you here. Jack has popped in. Cheryl is in. Susanna, Mark, thank you so much for coming in. We've got a 7 a.m. start time, so a little different from our normal, but welcome everybody. So this morning, we're talking extended realities. In particular, we're talking VR, virtual reality. And a lot of you out there probably know that I'm a big fan. I have an HTC Vive myself, and every once in a while take a short vacation out to virtual reality and maybe do Google Earth and play some I forget, was it like the Space Pirate game is something that's really fun for me, and the Wave VR, which is kind of a music festival sort of interface. Hey, good morning, Sonia. But I'm really excited to have James Watson here. He was introduced to us from Debbie Richards, who you guys probably checked in and saw her for her augmented reality conversation, which was last week. But the two of them originally were slated to speak together, but there was just so much content, we decided to split that stuff up. And so before we get started talking about James's topic, which is VR for training and assessment, the top 7 things you need to know, we need to know a little bit more about James Watson. Tell us your backstory, your whole, what the heck are you doing here?
What am I doing here? Very good question. So it's quite interesting. I moved into kind of what I'd say the immersive technology space about 4 or 5 years ago, pretty much in line with when the first, the DK1, Oculus DK1 came out, because that's when virtual reality came back up on people's radar. You know, it is actually a very old technology. It's been around pretty much, I don't know, I mean, in some form or other since like the 60s, but the hardware wasn't there, the software wasn't there, and the experience was terrible, and it died. Now, you know, the DK1 kind of reignited that. Palmer Luckey did a decent job there. And so I actually was working for a creative agency who tended to do more experiential VR. So they would create amazing experiences for the likes of Ford or Jaguar Land Rover. And there would be great one-off experiences, right? So see a car in virtual reality, walk around it, all these sorts of things. And I did a lot of talking at conferences because we were pretty much sort of out the front of using it. And at every conference, I would talk about how it's used for sales and marketing. And I would always then say, but the real opportunity is in enterprise. The real opportunity is in training and those sorts of things. And I would kind of always sign off my talks with that. And then I just sort of realized, I was like, why do I keep saying the opportunity's there and I'm working over here? So I was lucky enough to run into Tom Simmons, who's the CEO here at Immerse. And, you know, I kind of said, I'm bored of talking the talk. I want to walk the walk. And I came on to work here at Immerse. So it was quite a sort of like a 4 or 5 year journey to get into the right place.
Yeah.
And I've landed here, and it's working out fantastically.
That's excellent. So how long have you actually been working directly with VR and you know, in L&D?
So L&D. So I've been here at Immerse for almost a year now. So I've been in the sort of L&D space of VR for a year. The company itself has actually been in the L&D arena for 9 years. So they actually started off with desktop, and it was kind of language courses and the ability to interact on desktop in virtual environments. And then literally 4 years ago, they kind of had a light bulb moment. It went, you know, I think actually it wasn't languages they were doing at that point. It was an evacuation process for getting on board lifeboats. And it was, you know, it was 3D desktop. And they kind of looked at it, went, oh, this is pretty good. And then someone literally came into the office with the latest Oculus headset and said, have you guys seen this? And it was kind of that moment of going, wow, so this 3D world that you're looking at on a screen that isn't immersive, you're saying I could put it in this headset, and then you could walk around that scene and you could actually interact. And that was kind of the moment that the company went, we're going to go full on and look at VR. So it was a very brave decision by the co-founders 4 years ago, because the market didn't realize the opportunity. The market wasn't there. So they looked ahead and they said, we think VR is an important tool for the L&D community. And they kind of took it from there. So it was a gutsy move.
Right. And, and doing research for this series, that's what I found repeatedly is how much VR could actually have an impact on the training space.
Yeah.
It just seems like that is an excellent match, just because, sort of like, especially when it comes to, simulations that are developed for like risk management, things like that. And, and the other thing that I think about with this is that, like, for instance, it's 2019 right now. 10 years ago in 2009, like, what were we doing? I mean, who had an iPhone? Smartphone technology was still kind of just in its infancy.
Yeah.
And so, as somebody that's working in this space and with these types of technologies, if you could be like 10 years from now, if you could have the conversation with yourself, like whoever you are, James Watson, in 2029, coming back to 2019 and talking to yourself, what do you think you'd be able to say? Whether or not VR was the right place to be, and how much the world has changed, and anybody else in chat too. If you could be your future self and like look back and talk to yourself like the person that you are now, like, are you in the right place? Is VR the direction that you think everything's going to go in this space? What are some things that are going to disappear and that,
I don't think it's the only direction. I do believe it's not something that we're going to look back in 10 years and go, oof, that was the wrong thing to do. I actually think what will happen, and 10 years is maybe pushing it a little bit, but I think all these immersive technologies will come together. So you will have a mix of AR and VR, obviously, and at the moment, and there's talking about cross reality or whatever. I think what could happen, 10 years may be a little ambitious, but maybe not. You can never quite tell. I think what you'll have is the hardware will basically cater for different types of immersive technology. So I think, at the moment, that you should get your hands on the Oculus Quest if you can, Louis, because that's the latest headset and it's untethered. It's phenomenal. It's really a game changer. That in effect is, I haven't got one to hand, unfortunately. It's a computer on your face. A bit like Microsoft HoloLens. It's got all the processing power there. There's no PC. There's nothing. So if you think of how that has evolved in the last 4 years, I think what you could see in 10 years is a headset that is more like glasses, that basically has different modes. So you tap one mode and it's AR. You're walking down the high street. You're looking to your right. Pops up an offer for your clothing store that you like, and it pops up another offer saying the supermarket's got a special on something, and then you flip a switch and it goes into VR mode. So in effect, you cut out the real world. You're into a virtual environment, and you maybe step into a film or whatever. So I think the hardware will drive the adoption, because if you have something that's kind of seamless and doesn't really interrupt everyday life, then you're going to find reasons to use it more if it's bringing value to you. I think 10 years, I'm not sure if it'll be 10 years. I think it could be longer, but I think you will have one device and it will just be really simple, unobtrusive, and that will change things massively.
Wow. That's something to think about, because I could just totally see like sort of onboarding experiences completely disrupted, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's going to be typical to be able to walk into, start a new job, and rather than sitting behind a computer, you're going to be handed a headset of some sort, and then, go through X amount of time training, in this virtual reality. And a variety of things. Well, with that said, let's go ahead and get into your topic, VR for an assessment, the top 7 things you need to know. I'm going to go ahead and just minimize like my video and my audio. When and if questions come up, I might pop back in and let you know.
Yeah, do.
But let's hear what you got to say.
Okay, great. Well, let me just share this. And as Louis said, please do feel free to ask questions. I will get bored of my own voice, so feel free to jump in. Okay, let me grab this. There we go. So I'm assuming everyone can see this. We did a little test before, so it should be working. I'm sure Louis will let me know if it's not, but I'm sure it is. Okay, so we're going to talk about the top 7 things you need to know. And that's going to cover a broad range of things that we'll get into. Very briefly, so you understand who we are, we have created something called the Virtual Enterprise Platform. So in effect, we are a software company. We have created this platform that enables the likes of the companies you see on the right there to create virtual reality content using, we have an SDK that they can use to create that content, but also more importantly, it enables an organization to push out that content across multiple locations. So if you have someone like Shell, they've got an awful lot of locations, remote ones. They need a platform that enables them to take their VR content and push that out to all their staff. And that's what the platform does. And the most important thing of our platform is that it enables you to measure how effective VR training is. Because if you can't measure it, if you can't have data around it, it's really worthless. So we enable the capture of that data, which is very important. So we're not a content production house, although we do produce content because that is the way to start a lot of these relationships. We are a software company who have built this platform specifically for VR. And we got some nice logos on the right. I won't dwell on those. I talk a little bit about them more. But, you know, if you look at some of the guys there, these are serious players who are already doing substantial virtual reality training programs. So top 7 things. We're gonna whiz through these. So first up, identify value. Second, exploit the uniqueness of VR. Third, identify key use cases. Super important. 4, what are you trying to win? Hearts or minds? 5, talk a little bit about hardware. I mentioned the Oculus Quest already to Louis. We'll talk a little bit about evolution of hardware because that's important. Thinking a little bit about the content, what you should do, what you shouldn't do, and also finishing on my favorite topic, which is data, because data is king. So identify value. It's really important at the outset for an organization to establish what they are trying to achieve. This is a useful quadrant that just helps people understand, okay, where are you on these different scales? So in effect, on the vertical scale, you've got more entertaining at the top, dropping down to something that's a bit more tool-based, a bit more sort of utility. And then on the horizontal, passive on the left, active on the right. So what that means is top left quadrant, that is more about sort of sit-back experience. So the New York Times did a brilliant one called The Displaced, which is actually quite old now. They did it on Google Cardboard. But that was telling amazing stories of refugees. And, you know, that was a sit-back, look at it. I watched it, found it hugely impactful. But it's not particularly interactive. You're sitting back, you're immersed in this story. So that's a sit back. And then you've got sort of games, top right, very entertaining, more active, but that can also mean gamification. We use a lot of gamification in our VR training for DHL, which we'll talk about, because that also drives engagement and retention. Bottom left, a little bit more interactive, so presentation. So that might be a warehouse that you haven't yet built, but you want to walk your key stakeholders around that warehouse and give them a sense of how big it is and get them to buy into the process. So you can kind of do that by doing building it in virtual reality. And then bottom right, which is where we sit. So this is the active learning, sort of hands-on. It's a real tool, it's active, and there's huge amounts of use cases and opportunities in that, which we'll come on to. So it's just a useful framework for people to go, oh, okay, I get it. Actually, I'm trying to tell more of a sit-back story. I'm kind of up there in the top left. So what this shows is you also, as you're kind of identifying value, it's like, what are you trying to achieve? If you look at the central circles, it's, you know, is it a productivity thing? Is it improve safety? Do you want to reduce complexity in your organization? Do you want to drive up efficiency? So all of these things can drive initiatives that you can roll out in VR. And then around the outside, you've got some of the sort of real sort of core benefits of using virtual reality training. A really obvious one: if you create some virtual reality content, you don't have to fly a trainer all around the world to train people up. So you're dropping transport costs, you're reducing your CO2 footprint, and that's so you've got easier access to remote experts, because with our platform, you actually can have multiple users in there. You can have up to 10 people in a virtual reality space. So what you could, one of those people could actually be the trainer, and that trainer could be in Singapore. You guys could be out on the West Coast, and you're in the same virtual space. So suddenly that trainer who could only do 2 training sessions a week because he has to travel, he could do 5 a day. So that's a big change. And then also higher trainee throughput. You can get more people through. It's just simple as that. You can get them through with consistent experiences. Moving down to the bottom there, it also replaces physical hardware. If something doesn't exist or you can't get your hands on it yet, then you can build it in virtual reality, which is something we've done for GE Healthcare. If you have a new air conditioning unit, big industrial air conditioning unit that hasn't yet arrived at your factory, well, you can build it in virtual reality and train up your engineers and train up your sales staff on how to sell it. I'm just going to pick out a couple more just in the interest of time. Faster time to competency. I've got some stats later in this deck that talks about how you are able to get people competent faster through using VR. And there's some interesting figures from the University of Cambridge about that. And probably the biggest one really is, and Louis, we mentioned this before, is safe training in high-risk scenarios. A lot of the work we do with Shell is, these are high-risk scenarios. These are putting out, small fires on offshore platforms. You can't do that. The best you can do at the moment is probably recreate it on desktop. In VR, you can give people a real sense of peril. There's a sense of jeopardy in there, and you can see how people react, and you can sort of stress test some sort of key safety workers there. So that is something that just cannot be done in any other medium. So that's kind of looking at, identifying the value it brings. What you also need to do is, it is a unique technology. You can do things in VR that you cannot do in the real world. So what you need to do is make sure you're not just taking existing training and putting that into VR. You need to rethink how your training works. Don't just take, a sort of a paper-based approach and find a way of jamming it into VR whereby people walk around a room and pick up papers and read. Get the person to do this stuff. This is a real example that we found on the web. The guy holding it, I think we may have photoshopped him, but certainly the scary green glow. And this is literally 5 things you're training. Click on the buttons in the right order. I mean, people will be doing that. They'll just randomly click. They'll be distracted. They'll be talking to other people, and they will retain none of that. So you've got to really make sure you don't just try and recreate. Use the uniqueness of virtual reality. Some of the really, so as we call them, VR USPs, right? The unique selling points of VR. One of the biggest ones is focus on the right there. You have a headset on. You cannot focus on anything else. If you're looking at a desktop or if you're in a classroom, you can look out the window, you could be doing your emails, you're on your mobile phone, you're taking a desktop-based training, someone offers you a piece of cake, you're like, oh, cake, that's lovely. Your concentration's gone. You're not in that space anymore. When you put a VR headset on, you're there. You're not going to be distracted because there is no distraction. You are closed off from everything else. So that focus is really important. And what that leads to over on the left is better retention. I've got some stats on the ability to retain information better having gone through a process in virtual reality versus normal training methods. So that focus is huge. And presence is also part of that focus. You feel as though you're there. And there's a whole muscle memory thing of doing actions, so it really does tend to mean that this sticks. And also, I mentioned this a little bit before, consistency. You can repeat the training exactly the same for every single trainee. There is no variance of the trainer. There is no variance of environmental factors. You can do exactly the same. And what that means is if someone wants to repeat training, they're repeating it so that they understand exactly what will happen each time. And of course, in the real world, things change. So within that training, you just have different scenarios. You can replicate a windy day. You can replicate a clear day if you're out on, out on a factory forecourt doing stuff. And then what comes out of this at the bottom is data. Data is the most important thing that all these things generate coming out of VR. And that is also a unique aspect of VR in that you can track everything. You can track every movement, you can track every outcome. We'll talk a bit more about that later on. So the most important thing and discussion we have with people, potential customers who approach us, okay, what is the use case? What are you trying to achieve? Simple as that. If you don't have a strong use case, don't be using the technology just because you want to keep up with the cool kids. Use it with the right use case. And some of the key applications for using VR training, obviously health and safety. That's something we are doing with Shell, and that is going through health and safety procedures that you have to pass in order to be competent to do your job. So that's a very obvious use of it. Moving down to the bottom on the right there, product onboarding. You can train staff on a new production line. You could create that in virtual reality and train them. And what's really interesting there is if the production line doesn't yet exist because it hasn't yet been built, you can actually pass back learnings from the virtual reality training and put those learnings into the real world. So there was one instance with an automotive manufacturer who created what they thought was the optimum production line in VR. And they found that as people were being trained on it, they were running into a certain problem at a certain point. What that made them realize is they didn't quite have the design right. And when they rolled out the physical production line, they made adjustments based on what happened in VR. And as I mentioned before, up on the left there, the scenario simulation. You can literally create anything in virtual reality. We've built an entire submarine in virtual reality, with, I think, 20 different compartments. This thing is immense. And you can do that. And what that means is the real submarine isn't having to be taken out of action in order to train the new naval recruits on. So all these things, all these applications, and they have value and they have relevance across, numerous industry sectors. You'd be hard pushed not to find an industry sector where at least one of these doesn't apply. So some examples, make no excuses for this. They're all our examples because I can talk in a more informed way about them. There's other stuff out there, of course. So taking the risk out of safety training, we created this for Shell. They basically wanted to train oil tanker drivers on how to deal with an overspill that would catch fire. We could do all sorts of things, and it should change the environment. It could be raining, the sprinklers can go off, there can be noise, sirens. You're really stress testing the people and see how they react. And then what we've done with DHL is actually put some gamification into the process, which is something I mentioned before. So this is a really good example whereby these are warehouse staff who are loading up these big ULDs that you can see on the screen, which then slot onto the plane. Okay, so they just slip into the fuselage of the plane. This is, not the most stimulating job, but it's really important. If they don't stack the packages correctly, then as our DHL client says to us, they're shipping air in air. For every gap, that is missed revenue. If they can efficiently pack it, you're getting more revenue for each unit load device, as these are called. But what we did is to try and make that interesting. We gave people points. It's like a big game of Tetris, but it's a really complex game of Tetris with a load of logic behind it. So if you stack things in an optimum way, you get additional points. If you don't stack them in an optimum way, you lose points. Because these packages, they're all sorts of shapes and sizes, so it really is Tetris. And what they found is by gamifying it, and we created a global leaderboard. So if someone takes the training in Manila, they can see the score from someone in Amsterdam, and they get put on a board and they can say, okay, you're 300th out of, the 1,000 people who've taken this. And what they found is that these warehouse staff want to come back and repeat the training. So this is unheard of, right? Before, this training would have been probably on the factory floor, which takes someone out of the packing process, which has mean time's being lost, and it would not have been very stimulating. It probably would have been quite difficult. With this thing, they can take it whenever they want, and they also want to come back and do it again because they want to improve their score. So it's a huge win for DHL to be in that position. And this is something we did for GE Healthcare that I briefly mentioned. So this is a CT scanner, very expensive piece of kit. In the UK, we don't have enough of them. And so what that means, it's very hard to get access to trained radiologists in using them. And the irony being is when you do finally get time to train radiologists on them, well, that means patients aren't being seen. So what that does is it backs up the waiting list. So, it's kind of like 6 of one, half dozen the other. You can't quite win with it. So what we did was create this CT scanner in virtual reality. It's a multi-user experience. They can all come into it, and a trainer can be talking through what they should do. And this was a really complex piece. We had a radiologist who was a subject matter expert try it out, and she was in there for an hour, which is unheard of. There's so much complexity here. It literally mimics every single process from the real world. And when she took off her headset, she was like, wow, that's amazing. How long was I in there? I said, that was an hour. She said, no way. She couldn't believe that it had been an hour. So, there is a level of detail here that you can really take these things through. So they can also be very sort of highly focused at technical training as well. And the last one I'll talk about briefly. So this is the submarine. This is the entire submarine we created. It's a multi-user environment. It also has voice, which all our experiences have. So you could have one person in one part of the submarine call someone in another part of the submarine and instruct them to carry out a certain order. So, it just gives you so much flexibility. In effect, you've created an entire training facility in virtual reality. So we're on to number 4. How are we doing on time? Pretty good. Number 4, so hearts and minds. What are you trying to achieve? A big challenge for people is to think about, well, how do I go about doing this? What's the process? I'm not really sure. And, my senior stakeholders aren't quite convinced about it. How do I really go about getting this bought in or brought in to my organization? Having worked with, a number of high profile customers now, there's a pretty straightforward way to approach this. So you go about, and a lot of you will have seen this, you go about initially create a proof of concept, create a minimum viable product that will get you to where you need to get to. So it might just be one scene within a VR environment, or it might be a couple of interactions either, and you just need to get this in front of the right people so they go, in theory, we agree with it. And then that would move on to a pilot where you're actually doing something that has a little more detail and something you might be rolling out across a part of the organization. That naturally then leads to a full production rollout. And within this sort of proof of concept, you've got to work out, well, often that's to win over hearts, right? That's to get engagement. You don't necessarily need real data out of it. You just need to get something in front of, say it's the CEO or the CTO, excuse me, and say, okay, look, have a look at this. You can see the potential. You can see why we should be looking at it. Let's move on. And then when you move into a pilot, that's when there's more scale and you're actually looking at data. So you just got to be clear, if at the sort of early stage, your organization has already bought into VR, they get it, well, then you might be needing to think about some sort of pilot that is going to bring out some meaningful data, because you don't need to win the hearts. The hearts are already there. You need to then come back with measurable aspects of why the organization should consider it. So it's really about the mindset of the organization and how you would therefore initially approach trying to deliver some sort of virtual reality training project. This is my favorite side. I love these dummies. So, with this, you'd be amazed how many people come to us and they're not really quite sure what success looks like. So you really have to define what your success criteria is. Is it, so for DHL, there was an element of better staff retention because there's quite a high turnover role in the warehouse. So they wanted people to stay longer. And by doing more engaging training and bringing gamification, that's what they were trying to achieve. So, or it might be that you want to, drive better take-up of training. You want more people to be stepping forward to take it. Once again, that might be something you would consider a success factor if you roll out a VR program. You say, well, actually, look, we've increased the percentage of people who are actually, self-identifying that they want to take this training. So it looks really obvious, but people still don't think about what does success look like, and you have to do that. So number 5, hardware. So this is a good one. So this is where I wouldn't say were, because the HTC Vive is still there. Louis got one himself. This was a bit of it was holding back the enterprise sector, because what we haven't got in here is the high-end gaming PC. So add that in, and you got your 2 sensors on the right, you got your hand controllers that you still have, and then you got all cabling, what have you, to hook up the sensors. And of course, you have a cable from your headset hooked up to your laptop. So it was quite, for an enterprise, say someone like DHL who want to roll this out in warehouses, they'd have to have a dedicated space. They would have to have someone to maintain it. They'd have someone go in and switch it on, make sure it's updated. There's a lot of kit in here. And if you, depending on what laptop you buy, this is going to cost you, certainly in the UK, and it's probably equivalent in dollars for you guys, probably around the £3,000 mark, about £800 for the Vive, and then, anywhere between 1,500, £2,000 for the laptop. So that's a lot. It's a big outlay. If an organization wants to roll this out and they think it's £3,000 a go, that's really a lot. So what has changed things hugely is the Oculus Quest. We have also got the HTC Vive, the HTC Focus, in the bottom left there. At the moment, it's not quite where the Quest is. The Quest is better, in our opinion. We don't sell hardware. We're hardware agnostic, but we're finding the Quest is kind of the best headset out there at the moment. And that is all you need. The 2 hand controllers and the headset. And of course, you've got a charge cable, but there is no cable. So you are completely freed from cables, which is huge. You get a greater level of immersion. You really feel you're in there. And that's basically a computer that you put on your face. There's a slight, you have less processing power because you don't have the gaming PC powering it. But as a non-technical person, I don't notice any difference. So there isn't a big compromise in using this. And this retails, the consumer version is £400 here. It's £350 on Black Friday, something we've inherited from you guys. So thanks for Black Friday. And I think it's the same amount of dollars over with you guys. So very affordable. For enterprise, it's a little bit more because they get support, and then it's a yearly piece, but it's still, vastly cheaper than what they had before. So this has really, really changed the conversations we're having, and it's very exciting. So content, do's and don'ts. As with any content, it's hard to get it right, and you need to have the right people involved in doing that. So you really do need a dedicated subject matter expertise. You need that person who understands what you're trying to recreate, and then you can, or the company who's building the content for you can then bring in the virtual reality knowledge of how to bring that to life. But if you don't have a subject matter, much as with creating any kind of training, you are really, really going to struggle. You can't make this any easier in VR. And in fact, there's lots of other things to consider in VR, because you are in effect putting someone in the actual environment as opposed to putting it on a desktop. So you've got to have your subject matter expert. It's also really worth thinking about the visual quality. What visual quality do you need? So this is the Shell example that I showed previously. It's pretty good quality. It's not amazing, but it's good enough. It doesn't need to be amazing, because when you're immersed in an environment and actually picking things up, you can see the person's just about to pick up the fire extinguisher. When you're picking things up, you don't look and go, oh, how come that metallic surface doesn't have the right kind of reflection on? You don't think that. You're picking it up because there's a fire behind you. So you just get on with it. So you need to think about how good that quality needs to be. And our argument is it just needs to be good enough that the whole scenario feels fully immersive. It doesn't need to be perfect. And here's an example. So this is literally just a floating platform on which people can do various tasks. It's about the task and the repetition of the task and the sequence of the task that's important, not the fact that everything looks absolutely hyper real. And as you can see, we haven't even built the environment around it because you don't need it. So, simplicity of assets, it saves time, it saves money, and it also often will mean it's easier to reuse. And people need to be realistic about what existing CAD data they have that they want to use. Lots of companies will say, sure, you bring your CAD in. Well, the way CAD data will be created for, from an engineering perspective is very different to what needs to go into VR. Typically, it's far too complex to be able to just drop into Unity in VR. You need to adapt it. You need to reduce the polygon count. You need to do all sorts of things. So it needs to be flagged that all your existing CAD data doesn't just shift across into VR. And a lot of companies are now looking at that whole reuse of CAD data because it's being used across different channels, but it's an important consideration. Okay, we're on to number 7. Data is king. It is all about data. So if you think about some of the environments you've seen, we can track everything that happens within there. We collect 30 data points per second for every user in that environment. So what that means is if someone has to go in and pick up a piece of equipment, they have to pick it up, take it across to a desk on the left, put it down in just the right place. We can track all that. If they drop it, we can track they've dropped it. We can track if they've dropped it more than once. And so you can build up an entire picture of what's happening in that environment. And what that means is you can ultimately look at key points where people are struggling, and then you can address your training to bring up a solution for that. So all those data points, they get captured, and you can either have each data point along the way, or you can have an outcome. So you can say, if someone does these 4 actions, then they get the green light and they move on to the next thing. And then all that is tracked. So the reports that come out of this are very detailed. We can create dashboards. We prefer to just push it out in a CSV file into either a learning management system or a learning record system, but that's really down to each customer's desire. What you can also do is we can record what goes on in these sessions, and you can replay it, which can be used for audit purposes. And when we say replay it, we can replay it as VR. So you could have someone take a training session, you could record it, and then that person could go back into that virtual reality recording and look at themselves. So walk around themselves doing a task, which is kind of getting a little bit sort of Matrix-like. And first time I heard it, it really hurt my head, but I now understand it. And so you literally, it's like a video you can step into. And what that means is you can go in and look at yourself perform a task, and you could have a trainer come in with you, looking at yourself and pointing out what you're doing wrong. So if that hasn't fried your brains too much, it's quite exciting. And so data, here's an interesting some data. We work really closely with the University of Cambridge, a chap called Thomas Bonnet, who's got the coolest job title ever. He's head of Cyber Human Lab, which I definitely thought was one of the coolest job titles I've come across. He didn't really notice it because he's just into his academia and loves it. I was like, you have the coolest job title. But what they found is, this was working with John Deere. They found that on the right, this 55% was basically if they apprentice trained using standard documentation versus an apprentices, because there's a reasonable sample here, who trained in VR. This was putting together a clutch. The ones who trained in VR were 55% quicker than the ones who had done the traditional training, which is pretty phenomenal. And some of the other stats here kind of, the 200%, so those, it's positioned as a negative rather than a positive, but basically those who trained with traditional methods made 200% more mistakes, or you could say those who trained in VR made 200% less mistakes. So, there's some interesting data coming out, which is really kind of somewhat irrefutable. And this goes back to my point as well about the data being really important, because in effect, you create the content. That content then generates data, and you can use that data to improve your content. If you find that all the trainees are missing a certain step, and they're going straight on to step 4 and they miss step 3, you could look at the environment and go, okay, well, maybe we haven't made it overt enough. Maybe we haven't really done the flow properly here. And then you can change it. And if that environment absolutely reflects the physical world, if it is a perfect replication, then you, as I said, with the automotive example of a production line, you might then go back in or take that into the real world and say, hey, you know what? This process doesn't work. That's why we're losing efficiency on it. So that's where it becomes really exciting. Virtual informing the real world. And this is something talking a little bit about the data and using that sort of playback ability. So we call it GHOST. They aren't actually ghosts. That's actually a really complicated acronym that our engineering team came up with. It's about the server that this all sits on, and it kind of makes sense, but I forget about it every time. But so they're not actually ghosts, although ghost is also quite sort of applicable for it. So what you can do is have a ghost trainer. So you might go into a virtual environment, and there is the trainer who has been pre-recorded and is going through a number of specific training exercises, and you have to follow that person. You can literally mimic what they're doing, but that isn't a real person in there. It isn't someone in another location. It's just been recorded. You can also have a ghost you. So in effect, what you could do is if it's about, if it's a speed related task, you could have the best guy in the company there as almost like your shadow, and you have to try and keep up with that person. So, it's not always the case that fast is better, but if it is, or if there's some complexity to it and you want to see the guy who's the best guy at doing this, he's the only guy who can do it like that, you could in effect be pretty much racing him. And that actually sort of takes us into that sort of competitor box down the right. So very, very exciting what you can do. These are things you cannot do in the real world, which is why virtual reality is the right thing to use. So there you go. That is a fly through the top 7 things you should know. So hopefully that has sparked some thoughts for you guys.
Absolutely, fantastic stuff, James. Love it. we do have some questions, and and we've got a little bit of time left here. Let me just jump to this real quick. Marco Ficini asked this one, like, what are some of the data points that you collect? Any idea you can give us?
So you can have subjective data, or you can have objective data. So subjective data is James picked up spanner and place spanner in position B. So you can have those, that is the data points from what happened within the VR. What you can then do is, based on that data, you can then have outcome points. So you could then say, okay, by the fact that they picked up spanner B, put spanner B in position C, and then turned dial C, outcome is success. So you kind of capture actual physical data points, which then lead to generating an outcome. So anything that happens in that space can be tracked. So whatever you do, whatever you haven't done, if you've missed doing something, that's also tracked. So that's everything's tracked.
Yeah, it's just mind-boggling to try to.
It is.
They're like the amount of data that you can actually pull out of something like this. And we've got like 5 questions that I have in the Q&A area, and to be transparent, they're questions that that I pulled from the description of what you were going to be talking about today. But I have one more I wanted to ask you. What industries do you see like VR training and assessment impacting the most? Is there particular verticals that are really being, that are really benefiting from this right now?
I mean, the great thing about this is it's applicable across so many different sectors, but there are obviously more where it's core. I mean, those sectors, obviously, where there's high risk. So, oil and gas is, they want to always be reducing risk, and they're very focused on that. So where there is high risk, that's very one. Where they're heavily regulated, pharmaceutical industry, heavy regulation, they need to have sort of very robust proof around efficacy of the training. That's very relevant. But what's really interesting, Louis, is that there's a lot of the sort of softer skills piece coming in as well. So I've spoken mostly about sort of health and safety and procedural. We're also working with some of our customers to do things like how to train sales staff on picking up on certain signals from key customers, which is much harder, right? So soft skills, the avatars don't look human at the moment. They don't have any real sort of AI behind them so that they can really sort of understand what's going on. So you're still going to have that kind of sort of slightly weird sort of, these guys are sort of not, they're real, but they're not real. But the soft sector, you mentioned, I think earlier, onboarding. The ability for someone to join a company and understand everything about that company within a half-hour virtual reality session, which a lot of companies are doing, and we're dealing with a big company out in the US to do exactly that. So there are definitely sectors where it's more relevant. I think there are very few sectors where there isn't some relevance. It's just a question of more. Everyone needs training, and my argument would be whether that's soft skills or hard skills, you have an opportunity with VR to not replace, because VR isn't the answer to everything. It doesn't solve everything, but it is definitely a really important tool to put into the training mix, which will help, drive all the benefits I've talked about.
That's fantastic. And basically your presentation is just an excellent sort of framework for anybody that might be interested in introducing the idea of bringing VR into your organization. I mean, it's just such great information. So what I want to do is make sure that you place your contact information down in the chat here, so that if anybody has questions, any information about, I'm sorry, what was your organization called again? It was Immerse. That's right. It's Immerse. And, just the URL for Immerse and where we can reach you. If anybody else has any questions, when I was looking at kind of the questions that we have loaded in the QA area, it's all stuff that you kind of went over, but I don't know, maybe there's maybe a couple that you can just really quickly go through here so that I can mark it as a summary. Yeah. So identifying the right use case and business case for VR training. So any way you can just sort of summarize that real quick?
Yeah, I mean, like with any project, right? Like with any sort of training you're gonna roll out, what are you trying to achieve? What is the thing you're trying to solve? You would do exactly that with any training. So I really, what I'd say, to be honest, Lou, is just approach it like any other project. It's not, don't go after the technology because it's cool. Go after it because it's the right solution, and just approach it in the way that you would approach it any other project. Have a clear use case.
Right. No, that's great, because the technology itself it can be just so, it's just so attractive. So, absolutely, you just end up getting focused around the experience so much that sometimes it's hard to to kind of filter everything else out, because you're so, so immersed in it. So
yeah, I mean, what I say is don't fall in love with the technology. Fall in love with what the outcomes could be and what it will solve. Don't fall in love with the shiny toy. Fall in love with what you get out of that thing.
Excellent. Sonia is asking, how far are we away from having affordability to launch VR for remote workers? Quite expensive equipment to send through the mail.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question, Sonia. To me, if you're talking consumer headsets, £400, that's going to come down. That will probably in a couple of years be half that, I would have thought, and there may be cheaper options on the market. So I think at that stage, to me, if depending on who you're training, but if you're training someone, and it's going to make them safer or it's going to make them more efficient, to me, even £400 isn't a lot of money. If you've got to send that out to a remote, location, I think that's probably going to work out as pretty good return on investment.
Interesting. I'm wondering, so for at Immerse, do you actually have any, professional trainers on staff that are kind of doing train the trainer types of activities?
You mean who are actually carrying out the training in VR or create? No, we don't. So that would be really down to the customer. If they want to have a trainer in there doing the trainer, they would do that. We have obviously a lot of experience in instructional design and those sorts of things, but we don't have, I mean, when we run demos, we have someone in there who helps people understand what they can and can't do. But yeah, the customer would generally say, okay, we'll put that person, we'll bring that person in to train.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so how about this one? Key steps you need to take to effectively and profitably use VR in your enterprise. You get a summary for me there?
Yeah, I mean, that really sort of, it comes back to the use case. It comes back to going about it in the right way. So I think a really interesting point is, we always sort of caution against spending too much on a proof of concept. You just spend the minimum you need to spend, save the money for the pilot. We're not in this for the short term. We don't want to, take the quick buck. Okay. We want to say, don't spend, tens of thousands on that, spend, whatever it is to get it done. So I think if you bring it in the right way and you don't, people don't feel like they've overextended on these things, then that sets you up to take that on through the organization. It sets you on to be able to demonstrate the ROI on all those sorts of things. So, I mean, I would say, once again, treat it like you would treat any project. It's just a new training tool.
Right.
And when you're going to launch a new training program, what are the things you do? Well, if you're going to use VR, and you may even not start out thinking you're going to use VR, build the business case, look at what you're trying to achieve, and then look at all the opportunity, the options. And actually, at that point, you might say, yes, it is VR. Or you may say, no, it's not. It'll work. We need this to work on a different technology.
Yeah, interesting. So, and it makes me, I sort of think about what Debbie Richards had said in her session last week about getting buy-in as well, like who to go to within your organization. And her thing was, find the safety people first. Like,
yeah.
Usually that'll lead you in the right direction. As soon as you hit them up, you might be able to get on the right path.
I mean, interestingly for us, actually, Louis, as well. Yes, the safety guys are always interested. What we find though a lot is it's the innovation teams who are out there looking at what is the technology out there that's going to impact our business over the coming 5 years. And so often the initial engagement will come through from potentially an innovation team. They will then go to the business, and that's when, if it's a health and safety related, use case, they'll engage the safety team. But it's often those guys who are out there because they're the guys just hunting around for what is going to transform our business. So often in innovation, they then pass it on to the business, and it kind of moves into the pilot phase.
Oh, that's great. That's an excellent point. Dinah's asking, how are you dealing with the physical discomfort that some people feel when using VR? Is this an issue?
Yeah. It's much less of an issue now, to be perfectly honest. My answer to this is the tracking is far better. There's less lag. My argument is, if you get car sick, if you get motion sickness, yes, VR may make you feel a bit sick, but I would say it's the same sort of number of people who'd feel sick on a roller coaster or what have you, who might feel ill in VR. But so there's the physiology of it, but there's also the experience in itself. If you create an experience where someone's having to move their head around a load of times and look behind them and look up, look down, sometimes the brain isn't quite tied in with from a visual perspective, and then from inner ear and all those sorts of things. So if you go crazy and look around a load in VR, you'll feel a bit sick. But you just need to design the experience so that people aren't going crazy in there, because we don't generally do that in the real world. So I think there was one of the first demos that came out on the Oculus was the roller coaster, which I think a lot of people tried. Oh, it was just terrible. It was so bad, and I think that has scarred a lot of people. They're like, "Oh, I did the roller coaster. I never tried VR again." So if it's a bad experience, it might make you feel sick. If it's a good experience, it shouldn't do unless you're someone who's really prone to motion sickness.
Right. And I think it's also the hardware too, right? Like 20 years ago, our headsets that people were using, the frame rate was so low that it was definitely making people, giving them motion sickness.
Yeah.
I know even just with the HTC Vive, and I think, my hardware is on about three years old. I had to use a really high-end video card just to make it work, but that thing, it's seamless. I never have issues at all with motion sickness.
Yeah, no, I mean, even in 4 years, even in the last 4 years since the DK1 to the Quest or the Vive or the Rift, massive improvement.
Excellent. So the Quest is, you don't have any issue. It's not like a cheap headset at all. It actually gives you experience.
It's really good. It's a really good experience from a training perspective. If you want to if it's an automotive manufacturer and they want to look at their latest car, they're probably going to use something like, have you seen the Varjo? You seen that one? It's a crazy Finnish company. It's amazing. It's literally real. real. It looks real, and it's £7,000, so it's a lot. So no, the Quest is not a compromise.
Yeah, no,
It's really impressive.
Well, this has been great, James. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Really enjoyed your presentation. I know that, Eric had posted something about just thanking you, and lots of great comments in chat. So happy to have you joining us.
I've enjoyed it.
Yeah, no, this is great. Again, everybody, make sure that you grab James's contact information. It's posted up in chat. If you have any questions or anything, you can reach out to him. And thanks again for joining us this morning. Love talking about VR.
Likewise.
Excellent. And everybody have a great weekend, and we'll see you next week.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.